A lonely farmhouse in the heart of the Italian marshes. The date is July 5th, 1902. An 11-year-old girl sits on the stone steps of her home, carefully mending a shirt. At her side, her baby sister is fast asleep, tucked away from the sweltering heat. The July sun is brutal, beating down on the dry fields with a heavy, suffocating weight. In the far distance, you can hear the rhythmic clatter of the threshing machine. Where her mother is working herself to exhaustion, she has no idea. But inside the barn, just a few yards away, a 20-year-old man has just made a terrible decision. In the next few minutes, Maria Goretti is going to face the greatest trial any human soul can endure. And she is going to respond with one single word. No. A no, spoken by an 11-year-old peasant girl who could neither read nor write. A no that would cost her life. And a no that 48 years later would fill St. Peter's Square with 500,000 people. This is the story of the youngest saint ever canonized by the Church. But it is also the story of something almost no one talks about. What that no did to the man who wounded her. Because Maria Goretti didn't just conquer heaven, she conquered the darkest soul in her own story. Before we begin this journey into the depths of grace and sacrifice, I want to ask you for something very simple. Please like this video, hit that thumbs up button right below, and subscribe to the channel by clicking the red button. This helps this message of purity and hope reach the hearts that need it most. And if you have a special intention, a prayer request weighing on your heart, write it in the comments. At the end of this video, we will pray to Saint Maria Goretti together, and your intention will be carried in that prayer. Now, let's go back to Italy, but not to 1902 quite yet. We must go back 12 years earlier, to a tiny village of rolling hills overlooking the Adriatic Sea, Corinaldo, a walled town perched high on a hill in the marsh region, in the province of Ancona. Narrow stone alleys, steep staircases, and church bells that ring the Angelus 3 times every single day. Surrounding it all, as far as the eye can see, are fields of wheat and olive groves that ripple like waves down toward the sea. There, on October 16, 1890, in a humble cottage, a baby girl is born to Luigi Goretti and Assunta Carlini. I want you to pay attention to this detail, because it tells you everything you need to know about this family. The very next day, not a month later, not when it was convenient, the very next day, they carried her to the church to be baptized. For Luigi and Assunta, a child without baptism was a child missing the most important thing in the universe. They named her Maria, in honor of the Blessed Virgin. The Gorettis were peasants. They were poor, and I mean truly poor, the kind of poverty where you count every single crust of bread. Luigi worked the land from sunrise to sunset as a sharecropper. The land wasn't his, and at every harvest, the lion's share of the crop went straight to the landlord. And what about Assunta? Assunta could not read or write. She never had the chance to learn. She had been orphaned as a small child, raised from house to house, working since she was a little girl. And yet, listen closely to this. That illiterate woman became the first professor of theology for a future saint. Everything Assunta knew about God, she kept guarded in her memory. The prayers, the catechism, question by question, the stories of Jesus and Our Lady, and everything, absolutely everything, she passed down to Maria by word of mouth, by the fireside in the winter, under the vine trellis in the summer, while she sewed, while she kneaded bread, while she rocked the youngest ones to sleep. Do you realize what that means? No one taught Maria the faith through books. They taught her the faith through life. Every prayer she knew carried the sound of her mother's voice, and the girl drank it in with a strange, holy thirst. By the age of 5 or 6, she was already gathering other children together to pray the rosary. The neighbors in Corinaldo would remember it decades later under oath during the canonization process. That little girl had something different about her. a serious joy, a firm sweetness. But the land of Corinaldo, as beautiful as it was, belonged to others. The family was growing, more children came, 6 in total, and the bread was running out faster every day. Luigi would do the math at night by the light of a dim candle, and the numbers never added up. That is why he made the decision that the poor have made throughout history. The same decision someone in your own family might have made once: to emigrate, to leave the land of their ancestors, sell the few belongings they had, and search for a future somewhere else. Imagine the scene: a wagon loaded with everything the family owns in this world, a few mattresses, a table, the large cooking pot, and the image of the Virgin Mary. The children are perched on top of the bundles. Assunta is holding the youngest in her arms, and Luigi is at the front, eyes fixed on the road ahead, as the walls of Corinaldo grow smaller and smaller in the distance. Maria was only 6 years old. She would never see her hometown again. The family first tried their luck near Pagliano, south of Rome, working someone else's land. And that was where the Goretti's path first crossed with a man named Giovanni Serenelli and his teenage son, Alessandro. Remember those 2 names, because the 2 families decided to partner up to find a better contract together. And that partnership led them all to the same destiny. By 1899, the Gorettis and the Serenellis arrived together at Le Ferriere di Conca, in the Agro Pontino, near Nettuno, south of Rome. And I have to stop here because you need to visualize this place. The Agro Pontino of that era was not the golden countryside you might be imagining. It was a wasteland of marshes, swamps, low, humid land covered in thick reed beds with clouds of mosquitoes rising at sunset. Malaria claimed workers one after another, season after season. The peasants had a name for that region: the land that devours men. No one went to the Agropontino because they wanted to. You only went there if every other door was slammed shut. The 2 families moved into an old 2-story stone house called La Cascina Antica. The Serenellis and the Gorettis lived under the same roof, sharing the kitchen, the stairs, the table, 11 people in total. Life there was work and more work, waking up before the sun. The men went to the fields, their legs submerged in the stagnant water of the canals. Assunta went with them, because they needed every pair of hands just to survive. And at night they all sat around the same table, where the difference between the 2 families became sharp, because when dinner was over, Assunta would reach for her rosary, and the Gorettis would pray. But the Serenellis, Giovanni the father, reached for the wine. He sank deeper into alcoholism every year, and with the wine came the shouting and the bitterness. And his son, Alessandro would get up from the table and lock himself in his room. I want you to look closely at this young man, because his story matters. And by the end of this video, you will understand why I am telling you this. Alessandro grew up without a mother. He lost her when he was very young, just one tragedy among many in that family. He grew up without tenderness, without faith, without anyone to speak to him about God the way Assunta spoke to Maria. As a teenager, he had worked near the seaports, and from there he brought back magazines and readings that poisoned his imagination. Images that he pinned to the walls of his room. A soul abandoned to its own devices, slowly feeding on the creeping darkness. Picture this: 2 families living under the same roof, one little girl faithfully praying the most holy rosary every single night, and a young man sinking into a bottomless silence, separated only by a thin wooden door. No one knew it yet, but inside the walls of that old farmhouse, 2 stories were being written simultaneously: the story of a saint and the story of a gruesome tragedy. And then, the land that devours men finally claimed its prize. In the spring of 1900, Luigi Goretti fell ill, malaria. The fevers rose and fell. Then they rose and stayed there. That strong man, that hard-working father who had crossed half of Italy just to find bread for his children, was consumed in a matter of days. He burned in his bed, while Assunta pressed cool cloths to his forehead, cloths that did absolutely nothing to stop the fire within. Maria, only 9 years old, moved in and out of that room on tiptoe. She brought him water. She knelt by the door in constant prayer. And on May 6, 1900, Luigi Goretti breathed his last. He was only 41 years old. But before he died, with the very last ounce of strength in his broken body, he took his wife's hand and pleaded for one thing: Assunta, go back to Corinaldo. Take the children and go back. He sensed it. He felt it in his bones. He knew that this land, this house, this forced cohabitation with the Serenelli family would bring nothing but ruin. It was his final request in this world. But Assunta, she couldn't leave. With what money? The debts of the sharecropping contract held her bound, hand and foot. And now that Luigi was gone, it was Giovanni Serenelli who controlled the accounts, the crops, and the survival of them all. An illiterate widow, with 6 mouths to feed, in a foreign land, completely dependent on another family. Returning home was not just difficult, it was impossible. And so, the family stayed. They were trapped. Listen closely to that word, because it carries the weight of what is to come. They were trapped in the same house where Alessandro lived. Assunta had to take her husband's place in the fields, laboring from sunrise to sunset, doing the backbreaking work of a man. And tell me, who holds a home together when the father is dead? And the mother spends her entire life in the mud of the furrows. A 9-year-old girl, Maria Goretti, took over the entire household. She cooked the meals. She scrubbed the laundry in the canal. She mended the clothes of every person in that house. She raised her siblings, including little Teresa, who was still just a baby. She hauled heavy buckets of water from the well, and she walked for miles and miles to Nettuno, through the scorching sun or the biting rain, just to sell eggs and pigeons so she could buy the bare essentials. The people who passed her on the road began to call her the Little Mother. 9 years old, 10 years old, 11 years old. She had no school. She never once stepped into a classroom. She had no games. She had no childhood. And yet, and this is what baffled everyone who knew her and later testified under oath, there was not a single complaint. She was always serene, always available. Maria, can you help me? And Maria was already on her way. Where did this child find such strength? Where does anyone find peace in the middle of a life like that? I can tell you in one word: the Eucharist. For years, Maria had a fire burning in her heart, a desperate longing to receive her first Holy Communion. But there was an obstacle that seemed insurmountable. She could not read. And if she couldn't read, how could she study the catechism? But do you know what she did? She did what she always did. She refused to give up. She begged. She insisted. She pleaded with her mother, "Mama, when will I finally be able to receive Jesus?" She managed to find pious women in the area and a local priest who would teach her the doctrine out loud, lesson by lesson, question by question, exactly how Assunta had taught her to pray. All of this while she was still carrying the burden of the entire house on her small shoulders. She walked miles for every single lesson. She memorized the entire catechism without ever reading a single line of text. And in the late spring of 1902, Maria Goretti received Jesus for the first time. She was dressed in white, but in borrowed clothes. The dress, the veil, even the shoes. Everything was lent by neighbors because there was no money in her home for such things. She was the poorest girl in the line, and quite possibly the soul most prepared for the King of Kings. Those who were there said that after receiving communion, she remained motionless. She was recollected as if she were no longer part of this world. And on that day, She said something to her mother that no one fully understood at the time. A sentence that, knowing what we know now, sends a shiver down the spine. "Mother, I would rather die than commit a sin." Assunta thought it was just the fervor of the day, the big words of a pious child. She could never have imagined that her daughter had just pronounced, without knowing it, the exact blueprint for the rest of her life, and that she had only a few weeks left to fulfill it. Allow me to pause for just a moment. If this story is touching your heart, and you want to go deeper into the lives of the saints with materials you can read and meditate on at home, look in the description of this video, right below where it says more. You will find our devotional resources. It is a beautiful way to keep the saints close to you and to support this channel so we can continue telling these stories. Now, let us return to Le Ferrier, because the sky over that old farmhouse is growing dark. Alessandro had changed. He was no longer just the quiet young man who locked himself in his room. Now, he looked at Maria in a way that made her tremble. He began to stalk her. He hunted for her whenever she was alone, in the kitchen, in the stable, by the well. He whispered things in her ear. He proposed things to her that she didn't even fully understand, but things that her soul, formed by her mother and illuminated by grace, immediately recognized as moral filth. Maria rejected him. Once, twice, every time. She would run away. She would hide in her work. She tried to always keep one of her siblings near her. At least twice, Alessandro cornered her with clear, evil intentions. Twice, she managed to break free. And then, he did something more cruel than anything else. He threatened her. He swore that if she spoke a single word to her mother, he would hurt her and her entire family. Stop here with me for a moment, because this is one of the most misunderstood parts of this entire story. For weeks, Maria carried that terror completely alone. And many people ask, why didn't she speak up? Why didn't she tell Assunta? It wasn't fear for herself, it was love. In her 11-year-old logic, she believed that by staying silent, she was protecting her mother and her siblings from the fury of that man. And there was something else. Where would they go? The family was financially enslaved to the Serenellis. To denounce Alessandro was to be thrown into the streets. Maria understood this without anyone having to explain it to her. Think about that. An 11-year-old girl deciding in silence to carry the weight of the danger herself so that her family could sleep in peace and have a roof over their heads. That silence was not weakness. It was her first martyrdom, the invisible martyrdom, the one that lasted for weeks. This is why Maria lived in a state of constant vigil. She begged her mother, without being able to explain why. "Mama, please don't leave me alone. Take me with you to the fields." And Assunta, exhausted and suspecting nothing, gave her the obvious answer, "But then who will watch the house? And who will take care of Teresa, my child?" Years later, that answer would haunt Assunta for the rest of her life. But how could she have known? Maria's silence was protecting her too. The loop was closing, and we have reached the day you already know, the day of the staircase and the shirt. Saturday, July 5th, 1902. A suffocating heat. The kind of heat that makes the very air vibrate over the parched fields. It is the day of the threshing. The entire community is gathered at the threshing floor, gathered around that massive threshing machine that roars without rest. A mechanical beast separating the grain from the husks. Assunta is at the top of the machine, in the most brutal, exhausting position, occupying the very spot that once belonged to her late husband. Giovanni Serenelli is there with her. And the men are moving back and forth, backs bent under the weight of heavy sacks. And Maria is exactly where we saw her at the beginning of this journey. She is sitting on the landing of the external stone staircase of the Casina Antica, resting in the small patch of shade, mending a shirt. It is, ironically, a shirt belonging to Alessandro. which he himself had handed to her that morning, giving her a direct command to have it finished. By her side, resting on a worn blanket, her little sister Teresa is fast asleep. The deafening roar of the threshing machine fills the atmosphere, a constant, rhythmic thrumming that vibrates in the very bones of everyone present. In the middle of the morning, Alessandro leaves his work. He offers some trivial excuse that no one questions. No one is paying him any mind. He crosses the courtyard. He climbs the stairs. He passes right by Maria, and he orders her. He commands her to go inside the house. Maria does not lift her eyes from her needlework. She does not move. He calls her again, his voice coming from the darkness inside. She responds with a firm no. She will not enter. Then Alessandro steps out. He seizes her arm with violence, and he drags that small, fragile girl inside, toward the kitchen. The heavy door slams shut. What happened inside those walls lasted only a few minutes, and I do not need to describe it to you, nor do you need to hear the graphic details. You only need to know what Maria said, because while that young man attempted to drag her into the abyss of mortal sin, she fought with every ounce of strength in her small, developing body, and she screamed again and again, the words that summarize her entire existence. No, Alessandro, no, it is a sin. God does not want it. If you do this, you will go to hell. I want you to look closely at that. Study those words, because everything is contained right there. In the moment of the greatest terror of her life, she was thinking of his soul. She didn't scream, "You are hurting me." She screamed, "You are hurting yourself. You will go to hell." Was not a curse. It was the desperate warning of a soul who did not want to see another lost for eternity, blinded by a demonic fury because of that no, a no that he could not break by any means. Alessandro struck her. He wounded her gravely, 14 wounds, 14 stabs, and then he fled, locking himself in his room, leaving her bleeding on the kitchen floor. It was the crying of little Teresa, who woke up alone on the stairs, that finally alerted the others. Old Giovanni was the first to run up, and his screams of horror pierced through the roar of the threshing machine. Assunta came running from the fields. Her mother's heart, knowing the tragedy before her eyes could even see it, she found her daughter on the floor, awake, strangely serene in the midst of the carnage, and Maria, seeing the sheer terror on her mother's face, managed only to say, "It was Alessandro, Mama, because he wanted to do a terrible sin to me, and I would not yield, and I would not yield." 5 words. There is the no from the beginning of this story, spoken now for all eternity. A horse-drawn ambulance took Maria toward the hospital in Nettuno, a grueling 2-hour journey under the relentless July sun, traveling over dirt roads filled with jagged stones, with the girl fully awake, feeling every agonizing jolt in every single one of her wounds. The doctor who accompanied her would later confess that he could not understand how she remained alive. At the hospital, the surgeons examined her and looked at each other in silence. There was no hope, none. Yet they decided to operate anyway. And listen to this, they operated on her for 2 hours without anesthesia, because her weakened state would not allow them to put her under. 2 hours, awake. Maria endured the entire surgery without a single scream. She pressed her lips together, offering every flash of pain to God. The surgeons walked out of that operating room moved to tears. One of them leaned over her and whispered, "Maria, remember us when you are in paradise." And she, 11 years old, 14 deep wounds, 2 hours on the operating table, she had the strength to respond with a thread of a voice, and even the ghost of a smile. And who knows, doctor, which of us will arrive there first? Then came 20 hours of agony, 20 hours, my brother, 20 hours, my sister. The fever was burning her up from the inside, and with the fever came the thirst, a fierce, desert-like thirst. Maria begged for water, a sip of water, for charity's sake, and the doctors could not give it to her. Due to the nature of her internal wounds, a single drop of water would have been fatal immediately. Can you imagine such a thing? The last thing she asked for on this earth was a glass of water, and those who loved her had to deny her while weeping, just like Jesus on the cross. I thirst. In the middle of that final night, the chaplain brought her what she loved most in this world: Holy Communion, the Viaticum, the bread for the final journey. The girl who had waited 11 years to receive Jesus for the first time was now receiving him for the last time. They also placed upon her the medal of the Daughters of Mary, the association of young women consecrated to the Virgin. Maria would die officially as a daughter of the mother whose name she bore. But before giving her communion, the chaplain paused, because there was one question left, the question for which all of heaven seemed to be holding its breath. The priest leaned close to her bed. He spoke slowly, with great tenderness, telling her of Jesus on the cross, of how, in the midst of his own agony, he looked at those who were killing him and asked the Father to forgive them. Maria listened with her eyes closed, and then the priest asked the question, "Maria, what about you? Do you forgive Alessandro and from the bottom of your heart?" The room fell into a heavy silence. Assunta held her breath, and that 11-year-old girl, consumed by fever and thirst, responded without a moment's hesitation. "Yes, for the love of Jesus, I forgive him, and I want him to be with me in paradise." Listen to that again. Listen slowly. She didn't just say, "I forgive him," which would already be superhuman. She said, "I want him with me in paradise." It wasn't enough for her to simply not hate him. She wanted his salvation. She wanted to spend eternity next to the man who took her life. Brother, sister, that is not human resignation. That does not come from psychology, or good manners, or a sweet personality. No human effort can reach that far. That is Christ living in a soul. Maria did not forgive despite dying like Jesus. She forgave as Jesus. With the exact logic of the Savior, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." The child who had received the Eucharist for the first time only weeks before had become, on that hospital bed, a living image of the crucified King. The bread she had received had transformed her into the one she consumed. The following day, July 6, 1902, near 3 o'clock in the afternoon, the very hour the Lord died, Maria Goretti fixed her eyes on an image of the Blessed Mother. She whispered the name of Jesus, and she gave up her soul. She was 11 years old, 8 months, and 20 days. And here, most stories would end. A saint has died. Heaven receives her. The earth mourns her. The end. But I told you at the beginning of this video that this story has a second half, a half that almost no one ever tells, because Maria's words, "Yes, I forgive him, and I want him with me in paradise," were not an ending. They were a seed. And you know how it is with seeds. They take time to germinate. This one took 8 long years, and it finally bloomed in the darkest, most desolate place in all of Italy, a cold prison cell. Alessandro Serenelli had been arrested that very day, found hiding in his room, not even attempting to flee. At his trial, the heart of Italy cried out for the maximum penalty. But he escaped a life sentence for one reason only. He was not yet 21 years old. His sentence, 30 years of hard labor. And do you think he was sorry? Not in the slightest. In that courtroom, he was as cold as stone. Not a single tear. Not one word of remorse. He even tried to blame the child. In prison, he was violent, rebellious, a constant danger to the guards and the other inmates. They moved him from prison to prison because no one could handle him. He destroyed everything he touched. He was a soul locked from the inside, rotting in his own darkness. But then, a bishop, Monsignor Blandini, went to visit him. moved by nothing but pure Christian charity. He wanted to speak to him of God, of forgiveness, of Maria. And do you know how Alessandro received him? With rage, he chased him out of the cell. He did not want to hear that name ever again. A year passed, then 2, 5, 8, and then one night. Around the year 1910, in the silence of his cell, Alessandro had a dream. He saw himself in a garden, an immense garden, flooded with a light that did not belong to this world, covered in flowers as far as the eye could see. And through that garden, walking toward him, was a young girl dressed in white. He recognized her instantly. It was her, Maria. He wanted to run. But tell me, where do you hide within a dream? Where do you run from your own conscience? And yet, she did not come to accuse him. There was no reproach in her eyes. She was smiling. She knelt among the flowers, gathered white lilies, and began to walk toward him, handing them to him. One, then another, and another. 14 lilies, one for every wound he had inflicted upon her, and as each lily touched Alessandro's hands, it transformed into a white flame, pure, burning, but not consuming. 14 wounds converted into 14 flames of light. All the evil he had done, transformed by grace and given back to him as a gift. Alessandro woke up drenched in tears, and he woke up a different man. He would tell the story himself, countless times, with these simple words: Maria gave me the lilies, and from that night on, I had peace. The very first thing he did was write a letter to that bishop he had once chased away, Monsignor Blandini. He begged for forgiveness for his cruelty. He asked for prayers, and he confessed every bit of the evil he had done, with a repentance that would never leave him for the rest of his life. Do you understand now what I told you before? I want him with me in paradise was not just a beautiful phrase from a dying child. It was a mission declared. Maria died and she went to work. It took her 8 years to break down that door, but she broke it from the inside, which is the only way a heart can ever be opened. And so, Alessandro changed. And it wasn't just empty words. The prison records confirm it year after year. The most feared inmate became peaceful, hardworking, humble. He prayed. He asked for books on the faith. The guards didn't even recognize him. He served 27 of his 30 years, the rest remitted for good behavior, and he walked out a free man, nearly 50 years old. But imagine walking out into the world with that weight. No family, no friends, no trade, and a name that all of Italy knew for the worst reasons. Villages closed their doors to him. He wandered from place to place, working whatever jobs he could find, carrying his history like a millstone around his neck. But he had one debt left, just one, a debt that no court could collect and no prison sentence could pay, and it would not let him sleep in peace. And that brings us to Christmas Eve, 1937. Alessandro travels to Corinaldo, yes, Maria's birthplace, where Assunta had finally been able to return, now an old woman, serving as the sacristan of the parish. The wish that Luigi had made on his deathbed, fulfilled 37 years later. It is the afternoon of December 24th. Alessandro knocks on the door. Assunta opens it and finds herself face to face with the man who took her daughter away. Alessandro collapses to his knees on the threshold. Assunta, forgive me as Maria forgave me. Silence. Stay in that silence for a moment. 35 years of a mother's agony contained in a single heartbeat. All the sleepless nights, all the birthdays Maria never had. Tell me honestly, what would you do at that door? What would I do? And Assunta, this is the answer I want you to keep engraved in your heart forever. She looks at him. She lifts him from the ground, and she says, Alessandro, if Maria forgave you, and if God forgave you, then who am I to deny you forgiveness? A few hours later, At the Christmas Eve Mass in Corinaldo, the entire town witnessed something that seemed impossible. The mother of Maria Goretti and Alessandro Serenelli, kneeling side by side before the same altar, receiving Holy Communion together, the mother and the man who murdered her daughter, sharing the same bread that Maria received at her first Holy Communion, the same bread she received as viaticum, the bread that taught her to forgive like that. If you have ever wondered if true Christian forgiveness exists, if it is possible, or if it is just a pious story to comfort the naive, there is your answer. It happened. It has witnesses. It has a place, and it has a date. Corinaldo, December 24th, 1937, and from that night on, Alessandro began to call Assunta Mama, and she allowed it. Meanwhile, the fame of the child from Le Ferrière continued to grow. First in the Pontine marshes, then in Italy, then across the entire world. People prayed to Maria Goretti and received miracles. The church opened the process for canonization. Testimonies were gathered, and something extraordinary happened. Something almost unique in the history of the church. Among the witnesses who testified to Maria's holiness was Alessandro Serenelli. Think about that. The man who took her life became the witness of her sanctity. His testimony: "On that day, I was the one who died. She was the one who gave me back my life," weighed in the process like almost nothing else ever had. In 1947, Pope Pius XV declared Maria Goretti blessed. Assunta was there in Rome, and on that day, the Pope greeted her before the massive crowd, the mother of the new blessed, standing tall and faithful before the entire church. No one could remember anything like it, but 1947 was only the beginning, because 3 years later, the day I told you about at the start of this video arrived, June 24th, 1950, Rome. The crowd that descended upon Rome for the canonization of Maria Goretti was so immense, an ocean of 500,000 souls, the largest ever recorded for such a ceremony in living memory, that something unprecedented occurred. The celebration could not be contained within the walls of St. Peter's Basilica. For the first time in the 2,000-year history of the Church, a canonization had to be held outside, under the open sky of the piazza, because the poorest child of the Pontine marshes had overflowed the greatest temple in all of Christendom. And there, amidst that limitless sea of people, sat a tiny woman, 84 years old, dressed in the simple, dark clothes of a peasant. Assunta, her mother, never before, in the entire history of the Catholic Church, had a mother been present to see her own child raised to the honors of the altar. The illiterate sharecropper, the woman who taught the catechism by heart next to a flickering hearth, now saw with her own eyes that same daughter elevated as a saint for the whole world to venerate. Everything Assunta knew of God, she had given to Maria through the spoken word, and Maria had transformed that humble seed into heroic sanctity. Tell me, is there any inheritance in this world better given, or more perfectly invested, than the faith passed from a mother to her child? Pope Pius XIII proclaimed Maria Goretti a saint, a martyr, and he presented her to the world as the ultimate model for youth. In his message, he did something extraordinary. He spoke directly to the young people in the square and to those watching across the globe. He asked them, as a father asks his own children, if they were willing to resist as she did, to choose God as she did, to say no as she did. And the entire square erupted in a yes, a thunderous roar of thousands upon thousands of voices that the chroniclers of the time simply could not find the words to describe. And do you know who else was alive that day, kneeling in prayer, giving thanks with tears in his eyes? Alessandro. The man from the prison cell lived to see the girl from the Garden of Lilies become a saint of the universal church. I ask you, how many people in all of history have seen someone raised to the altars, specifically for an act of love and mercy directed, among others, at themselves? Alessandro spent his final years as a gardener and porter in a Capuchin friary, living in profound silence and perpetual prayer. He was a gentle man, always with the most holy rosary in his hand, tending to the flowers. Think of that. He tended the flowers, and he would beg every visitor to pray to his little saint. Before he passed, he left behind a staggering spiritual testament. In it, he acknowledged without excuse the darkness of his crimes. He warned the youth against the paths of shadow he had taken as a boy, and he confessed that Maria had been his light and protector. He died in perfect peace in 1970 at the age of 87, trusting that he would find her exactly where she promised he would, in paradise, the no on the staircase. Do you see it now? Do you see the full circle? That no from an 11-year-old girl protected her soul. It conquered heaven. It rescued the most lost man of her time from eternal darkness. It consoled a grieving mother. It filled St. Peter's Square like never before, and it continues to resonate today, more than 120 years later, right here. In this moment, on your screen, no empire has ever achieved so much with so little, just 2 letters. No. Today, Saint Maria Goretti is the patroness of youth, of purity, and of victims seeking healing. Her remains rest in the shrine of Our Lady of Grace in Nettuno, just a few miles from the old farmhouse at Le Ferrière, which you can still visit today. You can see the staircase, the kitchen, now turned into a place of holy pilgrimage. Every year, thousands of people climb those very steps in silence. Her feast is celebrated on July 6th, the day of her glorious entry into heaven. But her true shrine, let me tell you this with my heart in my hand, is not in Italy. It is found within every person who learns these 2 vital lessons from her life. The first, that dignity has no age, it requires no advanced degrees, and it does not depend on your circumstances. An illiterate 11-year-old girl, the poorest of the poor, fatherless and without schooling, said no to evil with more clarity than all the scholars of her age. And do you know what that means for you? It means that you can too. That no of yours, to the things that degrade you, to the things that enslave you, to the temptation that keeps coming back, to what God does not want for your life. It may seem small today. It may seem invisible or insignificant. Maria's no seemed that way too. It was spoken by a child, in a kitchen lost in the middle of a swamp, and look how far it traveled. And the second lesson, perhaps the hardest of all, that forgiveness is not weakness. It is the most transformative power on the face of the earth. Maria did not forgive because the damage was small. The damage was immense. It was total. She forgave because her love was greater than the wound. And that forgiveness achieved what 30 years of prison bars never could. It didn't just punish a body. It resurrected a soul. Now, let me ask you the question this video has been holding for you since the very beginning. Is there someone you find it impossible to forgive? A name that still stings when you hear it? A wound you have been carrying for years? I am not asking you to deny the pain. I am asking you today to give that wound to Saint Maria Goretti. She knows what it is to be wounded, and she knows the path that leads from the wound to the lily. Let us pray together. O Saint Maria Goretti, brave child and martyr of purity, you who preferred heaven over sin, teach us to say no to evil and yes to God, no matter the cost. You who forgave with love the one who struck you and desired him to be with you in paradise, obtain for us the grace to forgive those who have hurt us and to let that forgiveness heal our hearts. You who were a faithful daughter and a little mother, protect our families, our children, and our youth, and walk beside all those who suffer in silence. Present to the Lord the intentions we bring today, those spoken and those kept in the depths of our hearts. Saint Maria Goretti, pray for us. Amen. If this story touched your heart, please hit the like button and share this video with someone who needs to hear that forgiveness is possible. Sharing is simple. Just tap the arrow below. Subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Turn on the notification bell so you never miss these stories. And if you wish to support this mission in a special way, you can do so through the Super Thanks button. May Saint Maria Goretti bless you, protect you, and teach you the strength of a no spoken out of love. Until the next video.